Throughout the 1980s, the International Institute of Boston continued to support South Asian refugees, particularly in 1988 when the Federal Amerasian Homecoming Act admitted thousands of refugee children of mixed American and Vietnamese parentage, whose heritage was a source of discrimination in Vietnam. IIB resettled hundreds of these children and their families, welcoming them into the growing Vietnamese communities in and around Boston. Although refugee arrivals were surging, federal funding for refugee resettlement was decreasing dramatically, and by the mid-1980s, IIB staff and operations contracted. By 1985, IIB had been reduced to a small but mighty crew of 60 staff members who spoke a collective 17 languages. For a time, IIB's principal program focus became legal services and advocacy. A momentous year for the legal services team. In 1986, IIB launched the first immigration legal clinic of its kind in the area. In weekly workshops, the clinic provided Boston's immigrant community with assistance in completing immigration forms and preparing their applications for permanent residency and citizenship. That same year, IIB formed the Immigration Detainees Emergency Assistance (IDEA) program, bringing together 50 local attorneys to free people being held at an immigration detention center in Boston's North End. The same year, President Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, dramatically altering the landscape in which IIB operated. The bill balanced stricter border controls and penalties for hiring undocumented workers with large-scale amnesty for the nation's population of undocumented immigrants. A tremendous opportunity for foreign-born individuals living in the U.S. without secure legal status to obtain permanent residency and pathways to citizenship. All immigrants who had entered the U.S. before 1982, and all immigrant farm workers who could prove that they had been employed for at least 90 days were eligible. IIB was one of several agencies throughout the country designated to help immigrants complete applications, through which about 3 million Americans gained legal status. Soon after the fall of the Berlin Wall, IIB welcomed thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing persecution under Soviet regimes. It also welcomed refugees from the former Yugoslavia, where a civil war had led to ethnic cleansing and other mass atrocities. As brutal conflicts erupted throughout northern Africa, IIB welcomed refugees from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, and Sudan. Then, the Immigration Act of 1990 created Temporary Protected Status, TPS, to admit people from countries plagued by armed conflict, environmental disasters, or other extreme threats, and permitted them to work while in the U.S. It raised the caps on both immigrant and refugee admission, created a new preference category for family immigration, and allowed employers to apply for temporary visas to hire skilled workers. The Immigration Act of 1990 also created the Diversity Lottery to grant visas to people from nationality groups currently underrepresented in the U.S. In the mid-1990s, IIB began working with families to help their eligible family members living abroad apply for this lottery in the hopes of being reunited. While working to secure legal rights for Boston's immigrants and refugees, IIB was also helping to ensure they were welcomed by neighbors and community members, working to protect their physical and mental health and safety. IIB's Social Services Department connected newcomers to counseling and crisis intervention support services, including a victim assistance program for those who had faced assault, racial harassment, or domestic violence. IIB partnered closely with the Asian Task Force Against Domestic Violence and became the first agency of its kind to offer resources for responding to domestic violence in a beginning-level English language class. In 1987, IIB, alongside other local resettlement agencies, immigrant-led community organizations, faith-based organizations, civil and human rights advocates, and providers of social, legal, and health services, founded the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, also known as MIRA. The coalition's first executive director was former IIB program director Muriel Heiberger. Highly active today, MIRA is now 100 organizations strong. To expand its capacity to serve more refugees and immigrants, IIB invested in volunteer training programs, bringing community members directly into the work of welcoming newcomers. In 1994, IIB connected with a community group that was serving refugees in a nearby gateway city of Manchester, New Hampshire, and opened its first field office outside of Boston, paving the way for what would later become the multi-site International Institute of New England. Today, IINE's Immigration Legal Services team continues to help persecuted immigrants, including thousands with temporary protected status, to apply for permanent residency and citizenship, and to reunite their families. It also helps businesses apply for temporary visas to employ skilled immigrant workers. IINE leadership sits on the Advisory Council on today's Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, MIRA. Hundreds of community volunteers are integrated across our organization in all departments. And our Manchester site serves more than 1,000 refugees and immigrants from countries throughout the world with housing and basic needs support, education, career services, legal services, and advocacy.